Today we're in the Rijksmuseum in the Asian collection. It's an often overlooked section of the Rijksmuseum because you have to go around to the back to get in, but it's well worth going to. Today we're going to talk with the curator of this area, Menno Fitski, who's going to tell us primarily about the Japanese section and its relationship to Holland. So join us now for the Japanese collection in the Rijksmuseum. Menno, we're here in the Asian section of the Rijksmuseum today, and we're going to talk a little about the Japanese collection. Could you tell me what's the origin of the Japanese collection and why is it important to be in the Rijksmuseum?
Well, of course, first of all, we have the early Dutch collections formed in the late 18th and early 19th century. The porcelain was collected, of course, export porcelain, as part of the Dutch interior, and that's why we find it in this museum. We have about 2,000 pieces of Chinese porcelain and a couple of hundreds of Japanese porcelain, Chinese porcelain being, of course, always more numerous than Japanese porcelain. Yes. So that was really the VOC connection, the Dutch East India bringing stuff over here to Holland. That's right.
Well, along with that, you have some lacquer ware. Now, lacquer was kind of a specialty of the Japanese, wasn't it?
It was, yes. Originally, it came from China, but the Japanese gave it a new image, new techniques. The lacquer is basically, it's not paint. It's a substance that comes from a lacquer tree and it oxidizes. It becomes hard under the influence of oxygen, and it has to dry in a very humid atmosphere. So it doesn't dry actually as paint, but it oxidizes and becomes very, very hard. So it's a very elaborate process where you have a wooden base and you put cloth around that, and on that there are various layers of lacquers, up to 100 sometimes, and they are grind down, and you spray gold particles into the lacquer, into the wet lacquer. You place transparent or black lacquer on top and you grind it down, and then you have this very rich golden speckled ground that comes up, which is truly a Japanese invention to have elaborated that to this sophisticated point.
Now, within the collection of Japanese items and objects, you have some lacquerware that actually wasn't for export consumption, don't you?
Exactly. What we try to do is we like to show Japanese art as it was important in the countries of origin. So we have quite a lot of Japanese lacquer boxes which were made for the internal domestic market. So we have cosmetic boxes, boxes for paper, writing boxes with the ink stone and a place to put the brushes and the water dropper to put water into the inkstone, and you rub your ink, and that's how you make ink basically. So we have lots of objects that really were for use of very high quality. That's what we like to show people.
Speaking of ink, now part of the Japanese art was in fact painting at that time, wasn't it? Could you tell us a little about the painting in Japan?
Painting in Japan is, of course, a very broad subject. Basically, there's a lot of Chinese influence. You can see that very clearly if you look at landscape painting in particular. From Japanese court culture. We don't have many examples of that, but we do have quite a lot of Chinese influenced paintings of birds, paintings of nature, of bamboo, that sort of thing. And some of them are we have a very small collection, but we tend to have objects that are of high quality, and that's what we like to do here. We like to show people good quality art. And it's not our purpose to have a huge collection. We just want very good pieces, basically.
Within the collection, I noticed that you have a lot of tea implements, which is very important to the Japanese society. Could you tell a little about that?
Yes, tea is extremely important in Japan. The tea ceremony, which you know is of course very elaborated, very much orchestrated and with fixed rules. And the object really is to have a small, very small tea room and to be together with host and the guests, to be outside this world. When you enter a tea room, you're in the private world, you're with your friends and you share a cup of tea. That's basically what you do in tea ceremony. And of course there are very elaborate rules, but it all comes down to being there with your friends and drinking tea. And as a contrast to this very elaborate and sophisticated lacquerware that we talked earlier about, the tea utensils are very much in this very Japanese aesthetic taste. Not very refined. The Japanese have a love for the imperfect, the glaze that crackles, the imperfectness of shape, and you can see that very clearly in our tea utensils. This is very sort of rough and unsophisticated aesthetic taste, which is very much related to having no pretensions and being there with your friends in the tea room.
We're standing here in the sculpture room from all the countries, really, and within that there is some Japanese sculpture.
Yes.
Could you talk a little about the history of Japanese sculpture?
Yes. Well, as most things in Japan, the original idea comes from China, and in this case, it's very much the Chinese influence that is important. Buddhism, of course, was important in China, and that's how sculpture got into Japan in the 7th century mainly. Japanese sculpture was very much started to be developed on the basis of Chinese aesthetics, Chinese sculpture. And you see in these very early pieces that we unfortunately don't have here, that there's a very clear Tang Dynasty Chinese influence. In later centuries, we do have some 13th century Japanese sculpture. The style is very much Japanese. The face, the way the robe is dressed around the body has become a very much Japanese way of doing things. Japanese sculpture has a very still and intense quality about it. Yeah.
When I look around, I saw also there is a no theater mask. Could you tell us a little about the theater there?
No theater developed in the before the 10th century out of religious dance. There was gigaku, which was a ritual dance form with masks, and that was basically used to celebrate Buddhist or other Shinto religious festivities. And out of these religious dance forms in the 13th and 14th century, there was a development towards more theatrical performances where religion was not the most important thing. And No was basically founded in the 15th and 16th centuries, where this developed into a very stylized and ritualist form of dance theater, where there was a storyline, but it was very slow, it was very solemn, and it still is today. And the idea is very much that we wonder often why the masks are without expression, but I think that's just the point to make, that the more artificial it becomes, the more elevated above normal life, the more beautiful it is for the Japanese. Normal everyday life, you can see that every day around you. What you want in art is something that goes beyond that goes above the normal everyday business.
In Japan, in the Edo period of peace,
Yes.
There was a time when they wore swords more ceremonially. I seem to recall that, in fact, the emperor really wasn't in charge, but the shogun that was running the show.
Yes, from the Edo period onwards, from 1600 onwards, there was a military government in Japan. And it was a military leader with the daimyo, the feudal lords, with their own fiefs, their own provinces in the country, under the government of this very strict system where the shogun was the head of state. a military society, also, of course, the military was very important, and wearing swords was a very important thing in Japan. The samurai class was the only layer in society that was allowed to wear swords, and they used to wear 2 swords. So this was very important, and incidentally, it's a nice anecdote maybe that people say that Japanese drive on the left because samurai wore their 2 swords on the left, and if you would walk on the right, then your 2 swords might cling and touch each other, and which would of course be a reason to have a good fight, and that's to avoid that people drive on the left, and they still do in Japan. Sword is an extremely important object for the samurai. It is treated with much respect, and if a sword is on the ground, you don't step over it. You treat it with the utmost care and respect, and it is really the soul of the samurai. It is the most important thing in his life. Yeah.
Now, the Nederland's direct relationship was a small island called Dushima.
Exactly.
And what exactly was the relationship between Japan and the Netherlands and Dushima?
Yes, the relation with Japan started really in the very early 17th century when the Dutch ships went for the first time to Japan, and they were of course looking for trade. They had various trade posts in Asia, and one of them was in Japan. In 1639, as you know, the Portuguese were kicked out of Japan because they were Catholic, and the Japanese saw the Catholic religion as a threat to their order, their society, and the Dutch were allowed to stay because we made it very clear we were not Catholic, and we wanted trade. So in 1639 we were shipped to this small island, and we were allowed to trade there, and we did that for about 2 centuries. And during that period we have numerous objects, porcelain, lacquerware, that were made to order in Japan and carried back on the ships of the VOC, the Dutch East India Company.
Now, the Japanese influence on Delft and Delftware was somewhat profound when it started up, wasn't it?
Yes. Japanese export porcelain starts to be made from the second half of the 17th century. And what people did, we carried, of course, we wanted to order things. What we were interested in were shapes that were popular in Holland. So what we did was we sent drawings, we know that. We sent wooden models to have them copied in Japan, and we sent Delft pieces to have them copied actually. We sent the actual pieces. And with some pieces it is very clear. There's, for instance, a stand and teapot in our collection that has it's mid-18th century, and it has a mid-18th century Delft original that is very much identical to it. So that is the whole story of interaction. You have the Delft origin, you have the Japanese copy, the Chinese copy, the Japanese copying the Chinese, and the Delft makers copying the Japanese or the Chinese. It all becomes very complicated after a while.
You know, the Asian section's a little bit difficult to get to in the Rijksmuseum. Could you give us an idea how people can get out here to see this wonderful collection?
The Asiatic Art Department is located on Museum Square, so it's the back entrance of the museum. There's a separate wing, so if people are in front of the museum, you just walk around and go to the back south wing entrance.
Thank you very much for talking with us today, Menno.
Pleasure.